presentation I'm doing today is called Settler-Colonial Imprisonment of Palestinians. It is based on a talk I gave at a panel organized by Workers' Voice and Firebrand in San Francisco on December the 6th. So some of the numbers, the statistics in this are somewhat outdated because of how quickly the events are happening in Palestine right now. But the core of my uh, argument is still correct, in my opinion. So this was a panel on political prisoners and apartheid walls from Mexico to Palestine. And I spoke about the idea of a political prisoner, or what political imprisonment is. And basically, a political prisoner is usually defined, this is by NGOs and nonprofits, as someone who is imprisoned for their political activity, who is imprisoned on an official charge that is sometimes unrelated to their actual activity. While the meanings of the term political prisoner are contested, conventionally it refers to individuals whom the reigning political regime regards as resisting that regime in some way. A related term is prisoner of conscience, which has been popularized by groups such as Amnesty International. A prisoner of conscience is someone whom the state persecutes because of their personal beliefs. While it would be correct to refer to many Palestinians who are imprisoned by Israel as political prisoners, it's also important to emphasize that what Israel does goes beyond this practice and is even worse, as seen in the case of imprisonment and torture of children. The latter practice, understood through a colonial framework, sheds light on the logic behind the Israeli bombardment of schools, hospitals, and refugee camps, along with the Israeli Defense Forces abandonment of premature babies and incubators to death by exposure, and so on. These are all interconnected practices. Israeli incarceration of Palestinians, therefore, must be seen through the framework of settler colonialism and connected to the larger context of colonial expropriation of Palestinian land by the settler state. So Israeli imprisonment is not just punitive or politically disciplinary, it is genocidal. Understanding this, we can also understand why attempts by even those on the left to frame Israeli imprisonment through the lens of justice, why these attempts fail to address the root cause of Palestinian incarceration. Israel's imprisonment practices are, in short, part of a genealogy of settler colonialism, as the historian Ilan Pappé has put it. They closely parallel and indeed draw upon the experience of the settler colonial projects in the United States, Canada, and other European settler states. A settler colonial perspective highlights that Israel and Israeli Zionism, far from being a legitimate project of self-determination, are in fact a white supremacist colonial power and ideological system. From this perspective, we see that imprisonment is meant to destroy the bodies and culture of the colonized, and is therefore an aspect of the Israeli project of genocide. So let me talk about specifics here. By September 2023, according to the Israeli human rights NGO B'Tselem, the Israeli state held approximately 4,764 Palestinians. That number had jumped to over 10,000 by late October, which was the third week of the current bombardment campaign and invasion of Gaza. The older figure, that of about 4,700 approximately, is based on a 2021 study by the Palestinian human rights organization Ad-Damir. And that figure, the smaller figure, included about 200 children, 40 women, and 520 individuals held without charge or trial. The Israeli state calls that administrative detention. The number of Palestinians imprisoned since the beginning of the 1 week pause in the bombing and the prisoner exchange which started on the 24th of November, the number who have been imprisoned since that time has now exceeded by far the number that Israel released during that week. 80% of the more than 3,000 Palestinians taken prisoner since October 7th are held in administrative detention without charge or trial. As Tala Nasser of Ad-Damir has put it in a recent interview, Israel's, quote, mass arrest campaigns are still taking place in all the cities, villages, refugee camps, and other spaces of the Palestinian territories. And most detainees, she adds, most detainees are being held under administrative detention. Since 1967, Israel has imprisoned more than 700,000 Palestinians from the occupied territories of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, a practice that is illegal under international law. It need not be mentioned. Palestinians in the occupied territories are subject to military law, in contrast to settlers, Israeli settlers, who are subject to civil law. Human rights groups emphasize that these numbers are only estimates because it is difficult to keep track of the massive expansion of imprisonment since October the 7th. Under the military system by which Israel imprisons Palestinians in the occupied territories, any soldier or cop can carry out an arrest without warrant on the flimsiest of pretexts. In September 2021, another nonprofit, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, which compiles data for journalists and researchers, provided a helpful overview of Israeli imprisonment of Palestinians. I cite only a few telling examples. Their analysis discusses, for example, how almost all cases of Palestinians brought before Israeli military courts end in convictions, and that most convictions are the result of plea bargains. This is because Palestinian defendants correctly see the system as so unfair that if they go to trial, they will be convicted and given longer sentences than if they agree to a plea deal. This system is not only rife with double standards, it deploys torture as a routine mechanism. Physical violence, prolonged shackling, stress positions, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, denial of family visits, deliberate medical neglect of the imprisoned who are suffering serious health problems, causing, quote, many premature deaths. This is before October the 7th, but this was common. This was a situation before October the 7th. During the prisoner exchange in late November of this year, the world witnessed a stark contrast between released Israelis who reported being treated humanely by Palestinian resistance groups, and the treatment of released Palestinians by Israeli forces. The latter, among other things, assaulted released prisoners and their families during the release process. They delayed the release of prisoners until late at night. They forced child prisoners to wear clothes that were too big for them, too light for the cold weather, and to go barefoot. In front of Ofer prison in the West Bank, where families had gathered to meet their children and loved ones, IOF forces shot gas bombs and both rubber bullets and live ammunition. In Jerusalem, Israeli forces raided prisoners' homes before their release and assaulted journalists, preventing them from covering reunions of prisoners with loved ones. Let me talk about the imprisonment and torture of children. Of the 300 Palestinians released on November 24th, is the sound okay, by the way, right now? Sound is good? Okay, good. Of the 300 Palestinians imprisoned who were released by Israel on the 24th of November, most were teenage boys. Many of them turned 18 in Israeli prisons. Israel prosecutes between 500 and 700 Palestinian children in military courts each year. This was before October 7th. Since 2000, The Israeli military has detained over 10,000 Palestinian children in its military detention system, making it the only country in the world that systematically tries and imprisons children using military courts. Soldiers frequently arrest Palestinian children in the middle of the night. Before interrogation, children are blindfolded and deprived of sleep. Interrogators use verbal abuse, threats, and physical and psychological violence to extract confessions. There is no legal right to counsel during the interrogation under Israeli law, and military courts accept confessions obtained from children after torture. Children are charged as adults and receive lengthy sentences, up to 15 years. They are subjected to, as mentioned, harsh interrogations. Most are stripped of their clothes and interrogated for days on end. Physical and psychological torture to force confessions are common. I've mentioned this already, excuse me. About 25% of children are subjected to stress positions, and the same number are forced into solitary confinement. This is all from Ad-Damir and from the Institute for Middle East Understanding figures. Israeli interrogators make children sign documents in Hebrew, a language with which most are unfamiliar. Many experience psychological drama. The Israeli military practices deliberate policies of starvation in their prisons from which children are not spared. They have also been documented to kidnap children to pressure their parents to confess to crimes, whether crimes in the quotation marks here. And of course, children, like adults, are subjected to routine sexual abuse, along with the aforementioned other forms of physical abuse. Many, according to Ad-Damir, many able-bodied children become disabled because of physical abuse in Israeli prisons. Since October the 7th, liberals and even some on the left have made a moral equivalence between armed resistance by Palestinians on the one side and Israel's slaughter of now over 20,000 Palestinians, including about 8,000 children since October the 7th. According to Orly Noy, for example, she of the human rights group B'Tselem in Israel, in a recent interview, quote, "It is almost ironic that while Israel is incarcerating Palestinian children for throwing stones, at the same time, the only lesson that it teaches Palestinians is that the only way to actually release Palestinian prisoners is through such heinous crimes as the one Hamas carried out on October the 7th. In The Intercept, Jeremy Scahill writes, quote, "If, as Israel alleges, the Palestinians they imprison have committed violent crimes, particularly against civilians, then Israel should give them full rights and due process to see the alleged evidence against them, and they should be tried in civilian courts with the same rights afforded Israeli defendants." He continues, "Palestinians taken by Israel, including some on the list of prisoners proposed for release," this was before November 24th, "including some of those prisoners proposed for release, have certainly committed violent acts, but to pretend that the context of this violence is irrelevant is absurd as it is unjust." Self-described socialists, we've talked about them at length, or we talked about some of them. Maybe I'll mention a few names here. Folks like Dan Labatz, Stephen Shalom, Megan Day, Left Renewal, have gone even further than these liberals in their denunciations of Palestinian armed resistance and, quote, violence in their recent interventions. While many of these are well-meaning, I don't want to dismiss B'Tselem, certainly, and The Intercept. I think they do really excellent work, actually, and I don't want to roundly dismiss them, but I just want to point out to their logic, basically, this idea of like the equivalence of the two sides, and this like Israeli violence is Palestinian violence is a response to Israeli violence, and Palestinians should be judged in so-called Israeli courts in a fair trial. These are all sort of the assumptions underpinning this analysis, and I just wanted to point that out, basically. I don't want to say Jeremy Cahill is a jerk and we shouldn't read anything he says. So while well-meaning, some of these analysts misunderstand the colonial nature of Israel and therefore the role of incarceration within its project. Scahill's comment in particular suggests that he sees the role of the Israeli imprisonment system as criminal punishment. As he writes, some have certainly committed violent crimes, therefore justifying some form of imprisonment. The logic here is one that divides Palestinians into a binary of bad ones, usually associated with Hamas in this logic, on the one side, and the good ones, the innocent civilians or non-Hamas people on the other. This is not only superficial, mistaking effects for causes, but is also misguided. It does not clearly perceive the colonial nature of Israel and of its incarceration regime. Worse, the very logic which positions one category of Palestinians as, quote, criminal and another as, quote, innocent, good versus bad, is inherently a logic of liberal Western imperialism. In the written version of this, I link to sources for this. It's a logic of liberal Western imperialism which erases the material and political conditions of Palestinian oppression and legitimizes Israeli colonialism. This binary makes invisible a fundamental fact about Zionist colonialism throughout its history, that from the perspective of Zionists, the mere act of existing as Palestinian is in itself the criminal act. And I'll conclude with a few comments. The invocation of liberal and legal frameworks, human rights, justice, etc., is seductive. After all, Israel and Zionists, since at least 1948, have committed countless violations of human rights and injustices, and other injustices. However, to end Israel's crimes, we need to go to the root of the problem. This means seeing the Zionist incarceration and concentration camp system as systemic, as a tool for Israeli genocide of Palestinians. This is all inspired by the work of Black and Indigenous abolitionists in the US, aka Turtle Island, who have pointed out, as Nick Estes has, how we should really refer to the Indian reservations in both the US and Canada as concentration camps, and how these evolved into, among other things, the South African Bantustans. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz has discussed how incarceration of Native Americans on reservations, in boarding schools, and in prisons, along with armed aggression by settlers, have been different aspects of the same project, a history of, to quote her, constantly trying to think of ways to make Native peoples disappear. These writers also remind us, as does the gender studies professor Luana Ross of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, that, quote, Indian reservations are the only places in the United States where the criminality of an act relies exclusively on the race of the offender and victim, end quote. The Israeli settlers, too, are not unique. They are a typical product of settler-colonial states. To return to the United States, to cite one more example, the 1978 Supreme Court decision, Oliphant versus Suquamish Indian Tribe, eliminated Native sovereignty over crimes committed by non-natives on Native American land. Since the federal government rarely intervenes to enforce this decision, white people took this as license to commit crimes with impunity on these lands, as we see in the case of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls phenomenon and movement over the past decades. Moreover, the US state has historically criminalized not only, quote, violent acts by Indians, it has criminalized all aspects of Indian life, from traditional dancing and drumming to speaking native languages to wearing long hair. It might be obvious to mention here also that today rates of incarceration for Indians in the United States far exceed those of whites and are comparable to rates for Black people. So merely to exist as an Indian or as Black has been the criminal act throughout US history. Like the incarceration of Native Americans, the imprisonment system of Palestinians is the outcome of a genocidal European colonization project. In the case of Palestinians, this is the at least 3/4 of a century old project of the Zionist Israeli state. This colonization is ferociously supported by the US and by European imperialism, which sees Israel as indispensable to the project of smashing progressive, working class, and anti-imperialist liberation movements in the Middle East and North Africa. Ideologically, US imperialism and its European clients also deeply identify with Israel's racist colonization project, seeing it, in Marxist writer Max Eil's incisive words, as, quote, the purest expression of Western power, combining militarism, imperialism, settler-colonialism, counterinsurgency, occupation, racism, instilling ideological defeat, huge, profitable war-making and high-tech development into a manticore of destruction, death, and mayhem, end quote. To put an end to Israel's crimes, we need to go to the root of the problem, which is not quantitative. The problem with Zionism is not that its acts of violence and injustice exceed supposedly universal norms of human rights. The problem is qualitative. It is the entire system of colonialism. It is the entire system of colonialism and the larger system of US-led imperialism of which it is a creature. The solution is not reforming the Zionist state or its incarceration system. It is dismantling it and replacing it with a secular, democratic, socialist state with equal rights and dignity for all people between the river and the sea.